As our announcer said, this is Father Ray. I'm Jerome. I'll serve as the moderator today. The format will be as follows. Roughly 1/2 hour, or 1/2 of the total, will be a very informal roundtable discussion between Father Ray and me. The second half, obviously also for a 1/2 hour, will be a very vivid give and take Q&A with you. So you have a whole 1/2 hour to sharpen those questions. That said, let's start with what might be the single most basic question. What is faith-based funding? Father Ray.
Well, what we're talking about actually is how far is the government going to fund faith-based institutions? We have had a great deal of inhibition about that in this country. We have our First Commandment, our first
He is a Jesuit.
First Amendment saying that the government shall have nothing to say about about religion, and the government has generally abstained. And it's a protection for both church and state from being overmuch controlled, for being at all, in fact, controlled by the other.
Right.
Faith-based funding, it used to be almost taken for granted that no government money would ever go to anything for the use of churches. They were to fund themselves. And that's much different from, say, the way it is in Germany, the way it is in Britain, the way it is in many other countries. There was a decision made back in Clinton's time that there was an element of discrimination there, that where government does fund community initiatives, community has gotten into the definition of this office now.
That's right.
Where government does fund community initiatives, all of the religious groups are a part of that community, a very vital part of that community, and it was discriminatory not to fund them. There is another discrimination question that then comes up. If government is putting up part of the funding for an organization, is it legitimate for that organization not to hire anyone who isn't a member?
Yes.
And another discrimination question, and these two are opposed to each other. It's a question, how far is religion going to be a part of the public square?
Yes.
There are things, I'll tell you, my own impression is that when religious groups have nothing to say about public issues, you might as well forget about them. That they have every reason to speak their mind on the issues of the day, on the war, on race, on all of the things that are most concerned to us. If they don't, they're very much to be blamed for that. Did Pius XII do enough for the Jews, for instance?
That's right.
If the religions get into the endorsement of political parties, then I see the situation that Thoreau described in the 19th century. The man buys a cow, the cow owns him. As soon as you endorse a politician, you're property. And so committed that you aren't any longer free actually to speak your mind. And then there's a third way that religions can get into this, into the political realm, if their objective is the maintenance of their own power privileges.
Yes.
And at that point you get into filthy politics. And the churches are disgraced, or any religion-based organization is disgraced when it goes to that.
Yes.
They do, of course.
That's an awesome answer. You just heard Jesuitical exegesis all in 3 minutes. Boom! Everything you always wanted to know about faith-based funding, but were afraid to ask. So if we have an idea not only of what it is, but even more precisely of what a challenge it is at every single point of the definition, a challenge was presented. It's those challenges that we're now going to pursue. The first challenge, and I'll tackle this one, is the constitutional issue. As Father Ray quite rightly said, the predicate of the American experiment is that our founding fathers and mothers looked back on their common experience in Europe. Whether it was English, French, German, Italian, Turkish, it didn't matter. The common experience in Europe was that you had an established church. and that the church that was established used the civil arm of the state to punish those that disagreed with it. It depended on what state you were in, who was up, who was down. So the notion in the American founding was that this would no longer happen. Instead, two prohibitions would be put together as twins to stand forevermore together. There will be no establishment of religion. No American government can say that Baptists or Jews or Muslims or Catholics rule. There would also be no prohibition on the free expression and exercise of religion, which in many ways could be a form of subtle imposition. We might not say that the Congregationalists rule in America, but if the Congregationalists in Massachusetts, for example, say the Catholics are not allowed to meet in this state, you have an establishment of religion. And in point of fact, we did. Until 1833 in Massachusetts, Roman Catholics could not exercise civil liberties in this country, explicitly. Even while the Congregationalists weren't established, the Catholics most clearly were operating at an enormous disadvantage in every aspect of civil life. That's just one example, even here on these shores. So the notion was these two must always go together. No establishment and no prohibition of the free exercise. And it seemed like a good idea. As Father Ray pointed out, one of the problems that has emerged recently, and it emerged on both sides of the political fence, both Democrats and Republicans voted freely under the administration of President Bill Clinton for a certain set of rules that included one provision that we call charitable choice. And what that meant was, if you were Muslim from Turkey, or if you were Jewish from Israel, or if you were Catholic from Ireland, and you had come to this country, and you had established a certain charity, and this charity did very good work for very many people, you would no longer be civilly at a disadvantage the moment you said to the feds, look what we're doing in the inner city for drug rehabilitation or for reducing the rate of recidivism, which is the worst in the world for American prisons. Look at what we're doing. For these people, we are more effective than anyone else in this country. Why can't we get funded? The Democrats and Republicans said, you know, that's a good argument. Why can't they get funded? Religions typically do better in the small setting, anywhere, in a prison, in drug rehabilitation, than bureaucrats. So why don't we fund them? Why are they always at a disadvantage? The question was clear. The answer wasn't so clear. Because the moment Congress said, we're going to start funding them, we're going to level the playing field so that Catholic charities, Jewish philanthropies, a waqf for the Muslims, could now get some federal funding to continue to do the good work they had already been doing. Serious issues came up. One of the issues was, if you're a Pentecostalist and you believe that there is no good deed that is done without immediately witnessing to your faith, you cannot give soup on a soup line on Fridays to the homeless without witnessing to your Pentecostalist faith, should the U.S. government be paying for that soup? Because we know the witnessing is coming. And if the government is paying for the witnessing when that soup is distributed, didn't we just get a form of establishment of religion? And if that weren't bad enough, what do you do if you're a Baptist? The Baptists are particularly on the horns of a dilemma in America more than almost any other group. Because they say, on the one hand, there is an absolute wall of separation between church and state. And absolute, they mean absolute. Thomas Jefferson wrote one letter. He wrote one line in one letter. He wrote it to the Danbury, Connecticut Protestants. And he said there should be a wall of separation. That one line in one letter became the mantra. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, at the same time that he wrote that letter, was every Sunday attending religious services held in the U.S. House of Representatives. They didn't have a problem with it. So whatever his notion of wall of separation was, it meant you could actually hold Protestant services right in the Capitol building itself. No problems. So we notice that the culture changes and the definition of the wall of separation changes. But that means after 1996, what do you do if you're a Baptist? You think there should be no government involvement with faith, but you'd like to have the money because everyone else is getting the money. Now what do you do? Particularly if you're a Baptist, you believe that you can't ladle the soup out on Friday unless the people who are ladling the soup are themselves all Baptists. Now you really have a problem. Because why should the government pay anybody to hire only their own religion? Isn't that a form of discrimination? When did the feds get into the business of discrimination? So it seemed like a very good idea, rapidly turned into a hornet's nest in terms of constitutional law. There seemed to be no answer that was clear to American lawyers. And since the finest minds in our best universities could not come up with an answer, as we know, sadly, neither did the Congress. Depending on what law you read, in some congressional legislation, you may hire only your own. In other congressional legislation, you're absolutely prohibited from hiring only your own. Congress has never been of one mind, and it refuses to engage the issue directly. As a consequence, the law in America, the majesty of the law, is a mess. That's the constitutional context. In a word, a mess. Now I want to turn from that, Father Ray, to the question of how did faith-based funding emerge? And I thought I'd give just a very brief couple points, and then I wanted to ask you, why does that emergence lead to this issue of insulation?
Yeah.
Here is very quick. If you were preparing for a law school final exam, this is what you would need to know on the issue immediately, and spout that off in the first 2 minutes of your exam. In the year 1977, Peter Berger teams up for the first time with Richard John Newhouse, a very, very, very famous Lutheran pastor in the inner cities of New York, my hometown, in Brooklyn, in fact, who had done a lot of civil rights work in the 60s. Richard John Newhouse will describe an extraordinary personal evolution. He will stop doing civil rights work in the inner city. He will stop being a Lutheran pastor. He will stop being a Lutheran. He will become a Roman Catholic. He will then become a Catholic progressive priest. Then he will become a Catholic neoconservative priest. And then he will found First Things. That is an extraordinary journey. And one of the great milestones on the journey for him and for this country was when he teamed up with Peter Berger and they said, the federal government is too big. It's like the Europeans, the Italians, and the French, and the Germans. Horror of horrors. Americans should never be like Europeans. The old bigotry of 1776 coming back with a vengeance. We don't want a government that's too big. But the individual cannot stand up to the government because it is too big. We need mediating institutions, groups that stand between the individuals and the government and can say enough is enough, back off. The only mediating institution that can do that successfully and continuously is the church. It could be Baptist, it could be Catholic, it doesn't matter. It could be a synagogue, it could be a mosque. Again, it doesn't matter. Only faith communities have the power, to have the spirit to consistently say no to Uncle Sam and make the no stick. So they said the greatest mediating institution is the church writ large, mosque, synagogue included in the definition. And something must be done for the church. What could be done? Well, the notion evolved in a very, very funny way. Some people in Texas decided that George W. Bush, a very obscure person at the time, should run for governor. And when they decided that, the person who would run his campaign was Karl Rove. And Karl Rove said, George, I've got someone you should meet. And the person that George met was Marvin Olasky, who had been born Russian Orthodox Jewish. Another great personal evolution, went through the obligatory stage of absolute defiant atheism, and then became a very, very, very firmly convinced evangelical Protestant. Marvin Olasky said, Mr. Bush, if you want to win this election, you have to let people know you're going to do things differently in Texas than ever before. You're going to be the first to institute in any state in this country faith-based funding. This is how you're going to do it. You're going to find churches that are doing good things and that have been discriminated against, because discrimination is bad. And you are going to fund these churches, and you're going to let them know that during the campaign. And when they hear this, good policy is good politics. They will vote for you. And when they vote for you, you will get to be governor. And when you get to be governor, you will be able to fund them. And when you fund them, everyone benefits. Such is the genesis of faith-based funding in Texas. Bush does win the election. Ann Richardson, the incumbent governor with all the powers of incumbency, actually lost. Bush became the governor, and then, of course, in January of 2001, he entered the White House. On the 20th of January, 2001, he took the oath of office as the President of the United States. On the 29th of January, which is only 9 days later, a brand new office, utterly unprecedented in the history of America, the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives suddenly emerged. We always say that it sprang like Athena, fully armed from the head of Zeus. Never existed. The next thing you knew, there it was fully set up, fully funded, and ready to go, and actually handing money out. That's fairly awesome, especially by federal bureaucratic standards. This thing went through like greased lightning. Now here's one of the problems immediately. You count the days from the 20th to the 29th of January and you say, I never heard of legislation going through Congress that fast. Well, it never did. There was no congressional legislation that authorized this. So you say, okay, all right, so the president created something, but the Congress didn't appropriate any legislation. Doesn't that mean they didn't appropriate any money? It's a very smart question that you ask, because it does mean the Congress didn't appropriate any money.
Exactly.
So you say, so how the hell, with all due respect, is an office going to function with no money? I mean, what is the point? In Washington, if there's no money, there's no point. Sounds like big business. Well, the president said, we already get money for housing and urban development, HUD. We already get money for health and human services, HHS. I'll put my people in each of those offices. They won't have a line item budget. Instead, they'll get a fair portion of their department's money. I'll decide what's fair, because I'm the decider. And when I've decided what's fair and they get their money, everyone will be happy because everyone benefits. They will be able to help people apply for the money, and then having seen their applications, they will be able to grant those very deserving applications. Now, you might have a problem about fair play right there, because if I just told Francesco, apply to me for money, and then I say, Francesco, that's a great application you just gave me. Let me give you some money. You might think that there's this old rule that originated in the Roman Republic, carried through the Roman Empire, it carried through to every single form of jurisprudence we have in the West, in French civil law, in German civil law, in English common law, in the American common law. Nemo debet esse judex in propria causa. No man may be a judge in his own case. No person. But here the same people who are saying, why don't you apply for money, were saying, this is a very good application. You're getting money. There may be a problem of oversight here, particularly because Congress wasn't appropriating the money and therefore had no oversight. You say, well, like the office, that's pretty unprecedented in American history. And you think that's bad. It gets worse. In 2007, we have a very famous United States Supreme Court decision. Jay Hine at the time was the director of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Jay Hine was sued by others, the Baptists. About half of the Jewish community. Half the Jewish community supported it, half the Jewish community vehemently rejected it. He was also sued by a group I'd never heard of before, Americans United for Atheism. It's interesting, I don't know what they do on Sunday mornings, but they're united, so there they are. They sued. Truly amazing. And all these 7 groups got together, and the case went all the way to the Supremes. And the Supreme said, you can't sue. You sued on the basis you were taxpayers. You can't do that. Taxpayers have standing, the technical legal term, to sue when Congress appropriates money that wasn't right. Did Congress appropriate the money specifically for HUD and HHS for faith-based funding? No, it did not. You have no standing. We will not reach the merits of this case. Case dismissed. Justice David Souter wrote a stinging dissent, which is very rare for him. It's very out of character for him. He was so angry that the court had sidestepped all of the substantive issues presented. It's a long opinion for the majority, but it boils down to we won't decide. Precisely because taxpayers can't argue about what Congress didn't regularly do. And you say to yourself, but wait a minute. If I just heard him correctly, he just said Congress isn't reviewing it. The Supreme Court ducked. The president is the decider, and he decides. I know how we figure out what's going on here. We have regular federal audits. We see where the money went, and we see whether or not it's effective. Is it really true that Baptists do better at prison rehabilitation than bureaucrats? That's a great idea, and I'm glad you brought it up. Somebody should bring it up to the White House, because it still hasn't been done. So if we want to talk, as we did in our second issue, about American constitutional challenges, we now see in our third context, the political challenges, that the political challenges make the constitutional challenges look simple by comparison. You might say that on the one hand, the funding worked well, but then you'd have to say on the other hand, that everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Faith-based funding in terms of public review of the applications, when Francesco tells me he wants money, public review of the decision-making process when they see what criteria I have to decide whether or not his organization deserves to have the money, public review of what Francesco's organization actually did with the money, and finally, public review of whether or not it was effective, what he did, has all been conspicuous only by its absence. So one of the very best ideas to hit America, one of the very best bipartisan ideas, and we have very few bipartisan ideas in this capital these days, the Democrats and Republicans alike were united on the notion that religious groups should never be at a disadvantage when they are doing good deeds. You know the old phrase, no good deed goes unpunished, turned into a constitutional and supremely a political mess. There is no clear route through this to say, this is what should be done, this is what they're doing, this is just. Dignum et justum est. We cannot say that. The idea could hardly be better. The implementation could scarcely be worse. That, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, is the definition of a mess. And having said that, we now want to turn to the related question, which is the question of, okay, if we have a congressional and we have a constitutional and we have a political mess and we have no real audits and so forth and so on, what happens when government and religion start doing this mess together? Father Ray, what's this insulation thing?
There have been all kinds of precedents for when governments and religions come out in some kind of mutual support with each other and some kind of rivalry. There's, I don't want to digress too much into this, but we had this situation right at the beginning of the Constantinian period, a long time ago. Constantine first legalized Christian religion. It had been suppressed up to that time as far as he could. And he decided, first of all, his Edict of Milan, all religions are legal. And he got over that rather quickly. He decided that for the unity of the empire, it was necessary that there be uniformity of religion. You notice where the imperative is there. It isn't a religious imperative. It's an imperative of empire. And the verdict then was, you shall be Christian or you shall be punished. And that held through most of Western history, Eastern history. The Eastern Orthodox countries are still very closely linked to government, state churches that consult with government always on what they shall do. And in the West, it became more of a question of rivalries. But the basic premise that you shall be Christian or you shall be punished held even through the Reformation and the division into quite a number of possible ways of being Christian. It was cuius regio eis religio. The king was entitled to decide which of the various manners of being Christian you must be or be punished. And we haven't been faced quite with that. It's a possible. We're at the stage where all religions were legal. And then who is going to be the judge of which ones deserve a bit of funding? And much can grow from that. I come from Boston, where we had Cardinal Cushing years ago, and the question as this affects Catholics is very largely the one about schools. Should there be vouchers, some sort of federal contribution to the maintenance of Catholic schools? Cardinal Cushing was adamantly rejecting any such concept because he said as soon as they're paying it, they're going to run it. And therefore the independence of the church itself or of any religious group is threatened at the point where its funding is coming from a different judge. This, as you say, sprung full-clad like Athena out of the mind basically of Karl Rove. And Karl decided who deserved it. The various directors of the office, I think there were 5 of them through the Bush years, each quit at the point where he found out that suggestions coming from Karl Rove were commands. And the basis for those commands was party affiliation by district. And the actual religious consideration in this, well, what religious groups were important in a particular district? Were they in support or were they not? That's a very corrupt way to do it. The fact that this never went through the Congress, as you say, there was a very deliberate avoidance of congressional discussion. And George Bush, of course, had a whopping majority in both houses, and he didn't dare anyway go near them. We are very conscious that Congress can be very dense. If we look at what's happening now about health care, or if we look about financial reform, it can be very obstructive. And it can be judging all together on the basis of, well, who is paying for our campaigns? And it was never given the mandate to consider this particular question of faith-based funding. But it is our American custom to have these things discussed in the Congress so that we know what we're doing. We haven't really defined what we're doing in this financial relation between federal government and churches or other religious groups. How far this does amount to control. The religious groups, for the most part, are the people who are doing the good work in urban situations, the druggies, all the different things that are so underfunded, and their main interest is in the money. So that they're really not all that anxious to examine what's the result if it's coming from that source. And now I began talking as soon as we got into this question in our group up in Boston about circuit breakers. Do you have some kind of insulation between government and the religion-based group so that neither one of them is quite going to be electrocuted? If the churches are able to dictate government policy, we're having that over all of these social, what do we call them, the social issues. How far are the churches entitled to, well, make their opinions felt? Of course they had better make their opinions felt. How far are they entitled to dictate what's going to happen? The society is in great trouble if they do. We do have a principle of what we call civil society. There are, in fact, other groups besides churches that can be civil society. In the instances where a society was very much in need of liberation, the religion-based institutions have played a very important role. So we saw that all over Eastern Europe, where, as a matter of fact, there was a religion. It was the religion of a wholly Marxist ideology. The basic concerns of life were determined and any rival suppressed. At the time of the demise of the Soviet Union, there were not yet a diversity of political parties. And what happened instead was the development of an enormous movement that spread all over all of what had been the countries of the Soviet Union, and particularly in Russia, of the memorial societies. And the memorial societies, as a matter of fact, were never a centralized organization. They never got themselves a pope. Instead, they were local, and as in the more recent history, other institutions of civil society, such as political parties, such as community organized groups, have progressively been suppressed or discouraged to the point of disappearance. The Memorial Society gets to be about the only element of civil society left. We've just made a film about that. To have the churches and the other religious groups. I look at Islam in American prisons. It is of tremendous value. It's a stabilizing element such as no other that's been seen in the American prison system. It performs magnificent service. And who else is going to be able to do that? No one else has been very successful at it.
That's right.
So this idea of having the insulation, that is something that needs to be thought through. The courts have a role in that, and for that reason, I'm rather much with Suta, that it was a shame not to have the courts examine this much more dispassionately than people in need of campaign funding are able to do. The Congress should have a voice in this, because the Congress is where we try to understand ourselves.
That's right.
And, well, there's where the circuit breakers come in.
Amen to that. If we were to put it in one very small image, like a takeaway phrase, you might think of an innocuous title. And that title might be The First Church of What's Happening Now. The First Church of What's Happening Now goes to Counselor Butler, and they know she's very well connected with the Obama administration, to be perfectly fair here. And they say, Counselor Butler, how are we going to make this application? Because we know Francesco got all the money under the Bushies, but how are we going to get the money under Obama? And you say, well, this is how you're going to fill out the form. The First Church of What's Happening Now submits the form, it gets the money. Already we have some problems because we haven't quite seen how it happened. But the problems multiply because there is no circuit breaker, there is no insulation. Is the Obama administration now telling the First Church of What's Happening Now how to run its charity outreach? Because you have rules. Or is the First Church of What's Happening Now, through Counselor Butler, telling the feds what it wants them to do? Because again, there's no insulation. There's no circuit breaker. Who is influencing whom? Where is the greatest detriment? This is not a good way to go in a democracy, to figure out where is the greatest detriment. For an idea that everyone loved, Democrats and Republicans alike, you cannot possibly have gotten a greater mess. We want that funding. You look at something like Catholic Charities as a good example that we would be familiar with. What they do is very good, incontestably, and it's very public and very open. We can see the books. This should continue. But for the First Church of What's Happening Now, that always has Counselor Butler on retainer, and they always get their money from the feds, and we don't know where it goes, and we don't know if it's effective or not, and we don't know what the feds are saying to them, and we don't know what they're saying to the feds, we really shouldn't be there. Having said that, and you're beginning to think, what a mess, who's covered this? It's a good question you ask. It's our 6th out of 7 questions. And the answer is, really? It hasn't been covered in a way to make the public stand up, take notice, and march in the streets. And I say that precisely because the Pew Forum has made heroic efforts to examine every single aspect of federal funding on the faith-based issue. And the Pew Charitable Trust have funded the Nelson A. Rockefeller Institute in Albany, New York, to do phenomenal research from 2001 through now. And they'll have another one coming out. They'll be the first to try and examine, thankless task, how you audit where this money went and how effective the money was. 9 years late, people are trying to find out what happened with the money. You remember the famous phrase from the movie, though not the original book, on Watergate, follow the money. This is exactly what they're now trying to do. So the question here is, despite the heroic efforts of the Pew Charitable Trust and the Nelson A. Rockefeller Institute with these enormous reports that they've churned out, why has the public not engaged in a civil discourse that rises to the challenge? 2 reasons, very briefly. First, there was very brief and very intense press coverage at the creation of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. When Bush proclaimed it, 29th of January 2001, one of those dates you're going to take away because it was 9 days after the inaugural, the press said, oh my God, where'd this come from? Who's getting that money? Why'd they get the money? What are they going to do with that money? Was there a deal here? How much have they been talking to Butler? And for a while, this was the 24/7 news cycle. What is going on? And it died. 8 years of no public outcry. The issue didn't take. Fast forward, not just to January the 20th of 2009, this year's inaugural, but more precisely to Thursday, the 5th of February 2009. President Obama launches the new office with a slightly different title. Now it's the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And there are 11 people in 11 federal agencies who will be relying on Ms. Butler to tell them how applications should be made, and then they will be pretty much deciding who gets the money. If you hear an echo there, yes, there is an echo there. There isn't a big distinction so far between the Obama approach and the Bush approach. Again, this is a bipartisan analysis. So, on Thursday, the 5th of February, the press glommed onto the issue for one day and said, hey, new office! Maybe not so new. And on Friday, The very next day, the press moved on to the next issue, the story du jour. You have seen no major press controversy about faith-based funding since Thursday, the 5th of February, 2009. That's why the public is not up in arms and saying, where is our money going? What are they doing with this? And how much influence is there back and forth between the feds and religious groups that don't want to talk about what they're doing? We know what Catholic Charities is doing, but it's other groups that we don't know what's happening. There's the problem in a nutshell. It's not only a mess, it's a mess that no one is particularly anxious to investigate. That makes the mess all the worse. Our last question then, right before we open the floor and we get your questions, making up for 9 years of public failure, is this. What advice might Father Ray himself have for the recalibration, perhaps of this White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, or perhaps more generally, for how we should police ourselves? Father Ray.
Well, shall I be the one to decide?
Oh, well, absolutely.
One of the things that happens here, since it's become possible for some kind of faith-based institutions to get money, the big ones have learned how. And there's actually a very good service done in this Office of Faith-Based. And now the neighborhood partnerships is that all of the small fry, the people who aren't able to navigate the federal jungle, are given help in doing that. That the large groups, you mentioned the Catholic Charities, it's a large organization. There's, what is the name of the big equivalent Protestant one? It's, there's a Lutheran one, and there's a more generally Protestant one. I'm more familiar with Catholic Charities, all right. Smaller groups doing neighborhood-sized operations. What really needs to happen is a large public discussion.
Yes.
And that, in fact, is what we're aiming at with this conference. We've looked at this Washington session tomorrow very largely as a sounding to see, are people really talking to each other? There is a fair amount of serious scholarship about this.
Yes.
There are some constitutional lawyers with a
That's right. For example, Ira Lupu, Robert Tuttle, probably two of the leading.
People like these are very knowledgeable about the situation. They aren't much heard in public. For them and for the stakeholders, all of the people who are interested in the money, and for those who have the task of conducting the office.
That's right.
Office that's been conducted somewhat in the shadows, no appropriated money, all a matter of how do you steer people to money that is already appropriated, not specifically for this. That needs to be a matter of public discussion so that we have some understanding of how it's going to work. There is something very commendable in the idea that people doing good work should be helped to do good work. And there is something very maleficent about putting them under controls. So that the idea of this conference is really to open the question in a way that generates enough public discussion to get beyond this 24-hour
Absolutely, the 24/7
news cycle.
That's right. Comes and goes. You
Yes.
blinked, you missed it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've given you a mess. We'd like to know what you think of it, and if you have any questions about the mess. I think Joe is first,
Yes.
Cynthia
Joe.
second, this gentleman is third.
Okay.
Amal is fourth.
Yes.
Where's the microphone? I'm Joe Montville, connected with George Mason and American Universities, and I run a project called Toward the Abrahamic Family Reunion. When I was in the State Department, I went to visit a staff member of the Senate Appropriations Committee with an aide staffer to defend a project that the aide staffer didn't like. Rather, the Senate staffer didn't like.
Yeah.
And this aide was dispensing appropriated funds. This was for a peacemaking organization in Israel-Palestine. And they had a habit that the AID would send the Senate staff a list of grants it proposes to make, and the staff could decide whether or not it would support that. And if it had questions, they would be discussed. We managed to turn around the decision of this staffer, who was a very tough SOB, and I got a good reputation. But it was one way of dealing with the issue of accountability in appropriated funds. But that raises you to the, so the DHS and HHS funds could be subject to that kind of review by congressional staff. But that would bring you to the whole issue of, which I think we're trying to confront, and you've mentioned a few times, how do you deal, who can make a decision? Is a decision possible politically in this country to separate the proselytizers who insist that you pray with your soup or listen to whatever Pentecostal does at soup time? Or can you get a separation of proselytation from the administration of beautiful social services that are so clearly beneficial? And I imagine that's what we're going to be wrestling with tomorrow and in Boston next spring. Yes. And frankly, I wouldn't want, I mean, Karl Rove was wonderful. He's straightforward, totally corrupt. And this administration, I'd like to think, it wants to counteract all of that. But I don't know if they're ready to deal with the issue of proselytizing. And it's a powerful component of the American political culture. The John 14:6, I am the way, damn it, and it's a very tough issue, but it's where we have to really confront it.
Yes.
How can and we'll be confronting the basic issue of how can different faiths value the commitment and the spiritual value and the godly value of members of other faiths, and get away from the dogma and doctrine of condemning them to hell because they haven't been saved the way some very dogmatic way. So it seems to me that's the question we're facing.
And you've highlighted yet another mess, sad to say. Here's why it's another mess. Roman Catholics, by and large, would be happy in this country if we had clear accountability. And we would say that if Ms. Butler, who has the next question, were to stop making advice behind closed doors, and we don't know where the money went and so forth and so on, so that we now know when the Pentecostals get the money, why they got that money, and what they're going to do with it. And we would be happy if the rule said, give the soup on Friday, no proselytization while you're giving the soup. Do it in a separate building or do it in a separate room at a separate hour. Here's part of the problem. The Baptists say, no, that's not enough. That's unconstitutional. Because the absolute wall of separation between church and state says money is fungible. And if the feds are giving money to the Pentecostalists to hand out the soup, that means the Pentecostalists have their own money now freed up. What are they going to do with their own money? They're going to proselytize. So what's happening? The feds are subtly underwriting the pushing of the First Church of what's happening now. A mess. Father, did you want to jump in?
Yes, indeed. The idea of soup, is very Irish. There's an expression. An expression when people hear that there's been sort of a conversion there. People say, "There's soup there."
Yes.
And I was thinking of, when do people proselytize? Francis of Assisi used to, well, the story is that he invited one of the brothers to come out into the city and preach. And they walked around town for a while, and they went home, and the brother wanted to know, when are we going to do this preaching? And he said, we just did. If a religious group does work that is publicly beneficial, people are going to notice that. I think this is certainly why Islam has become so big in American prisons.
Yes.
It has done so well. And you have people of a variety of faiths who have behaved well in public. If they're buttonholing you and say, well, you had better say what I'm saying or you aren't going to be saved, we've got a place in hell for you, that's rather a different level of it. But to avoid any impression that there's something good about this people, that's rather beyond doing.
Yes.
We expect that of an American way, as we may variously define it, that we think if we do well, people in fact are going to be impressed. There's no avoiding that.
That's right. We'll now have.
If I can just, before Cynthia, piggyback on Francis of Assisi's story, you know, a smile is a charity
Yes,
in
of
Islam.
course.
So, yes, this is the question. How do you separate what is a charity, what is proselytizing, and whatnot?
Very fair. The much maligned Ms. Butler will now rise to the occasion.
Wonderful.
I just need to say that Jeremiah Wright is not now and has never been a client of mine. In fact, Joe Biden is a good Jesuit, so you're actually more inclined to. Okay. Okay, so my question is, and you've sort of touched on this on the edges, but isn't there a perception of corruption within the church when you have sort of, you know, soft money contributions, campaign contributions getting laundered through a faith-based office like this? And I'm I'm reminded of the poor tragedy of John Kerry's campaign, when he's from Boston, so you probably are familiar with what happened to him. And he was pretty much torched by the now Pope, I think. I think he was pretty much done in by the last, famous, infamous Wall Street Journal article where they made this single issue of abortion the defining issue. And it was not only, non-Republican if you didn't subscribe to that view of the world, but it was un-Christian, it was un-Catholic. You could get kicked out of the Dominican house if you voiced any kind of affinity with John Kerry's people because he had too many Emily's List people on his campaign, So my question is, don't you then create, and then all of a sudden the Dominican house was building an $8 million new campus building is on the federal United Way list that you can contribute to as a federal campaign person, worker. And you sort of put these things together and you go, I don't know if there's real corruption there, but there's a perception of the possibility of it because they just sort of distilled and reduced Jesus to one issue.
Yeah.
And, so I think it hurts the church. It hurts, and then it hurts the laity because it hurts faith in the institutions of the church. So, maybe you could comment a little bit on that. I don't want to lecture.
Oh, well.
Father, that one is all yours.
Sure. John Kennedy ran for president in 1960 and had to troop about the country. There was a famous speech he made to, I believe, Baptists down in Texas, saying that he was never going to he would never allow his church, to determine his political position on any question. And he was elected very largely because he made that clear. And in the more recent elections, what we have seen is an effort to introduce a discipline coming from bishops over Catholic politicians. I was trying to define corruption a bit when I first started off here about where you expect a religion-based organization, a church, a religion, to enter the public realm. If it has nothing to say, it's worthless. If it is endorsing a politician, it is owned. And if what it's doing is really a bolstering of its own institutional privilege, then you are deep in corruption. I've had a very strong suspicion. My sympathy is much more against the practice of abortion. I don't think that there is any way of trying to do this by law. I think only example and conviction can help on this. But I think what is actually happening in Catholic circles right now, on the part of not all, but actually a narrow little band of very aggressive bishops and a neoconservative Catholic right wing, is not really concerned about abortion as a question so much as it is about discipline. Putting church in a command position over Catholic public life and Catholic politicians. And that, indeed, is a very deep form of corruption.
Wow. You just heard a ranking cleric read the Riot Act. Now, we did promise we have to move in
don't
rapid
get into
sequence.
too much rank.
We did promise this gentleman and then Dr. D'Antonio. This gentleman.
Yes.
My name is Amin. I've worked in human services much of my life. And of course, the service of the individual, and in many cases, I won't say in all, but their privilege, their right to find their own conscience, their own meaning in something. And beyond a certain age, I realize there's moral formation, but one may have to struggle with certain things. I'm glad you brought up abortion, because I think that is just a very good outlining type of issue. So we can get so abstract around this without a good issue to work with. But as someone who's practiced mental health work, to be in an institution that would dictate to me how to work with an individual's conscience based on an institution's belief system. Not that I wish the institution not to have the belief system, but to chain someone into a particular point of view, or to not offer a service, especially in a place where there may not be much choice of service. I believe there was a television show, maybe it was on Moyers, I'm not sure, that were about abortion clinics that were in the South. And they changed a lot of the regulations, so those clinics were not funded, but they were right-to-life types of clinics where people would be encouraged to keep the children, etc. But the other option was not provided. Now, of course, the other great concern that I have is we are so absolutely enthralled with protecting the right of the embryo, the right of the sperm, the right to life, the right not to take your life and leave, but we don't seem to be as concerned with providing adequate support to people for food, for shelter, for all of these basic necessities. And I get concerned when a church, any church, uses its power to fight over what I want to call, and forgive me, this may be insulting, a marginal issue, how you come in and how you go out, but they're not really focusing on the essentials of how we're here and the fairness of how we divide the things here. And I'm concerned even with the fundamentalists that made that horrible union with Karl Rove and George Bush, that devil's dilemma, for a few family-centered values, as if, providing for the child after its birth isn't the family-centered value.
Yeah.
We'll take a brief answer to this one, and then I did slip up as moderator, so I have to apologize.
Okay.
We'll take two brief questions more. and
Yeah,
we'll
I don't know
finish.
if there is a
Ermal-
brief answer, but
Right,
Yeah.
1 second. I did slip up. Ermal did have the next question, then Dr. D'Antonio will get the closing question, and then we'll be done.
Yes.
No kein mal, mein Vater.
The concern for human life, I think it is very genuine among a lot of people.
Yes.
I feel the abortion question at that
Yes.
level. Concern for human life now, we had our Cardinal Bernardine out in Chicago who used to talk about the seamless garment. I look at the concern for human life, and my first question is about global warming and about government policy over a long period, longer than the Bush administration, but certainly flagrant in the Bush administration, that put the interests of the oil industry and the energy industry and the banks and the corporate interests above this. And I anticipate that now we're hearing the global warming's effects are progressing much more rapidly than we had heard about. I'll hear the abortion compared in Catholic circles with the death toll of the Holocaust. And, all right, into big numbers. The death toll we can anticipate from the rising of sea levels is staggering. It puts this question of embryonic life so far in the shade. You call it a marginal issue. Well, every life is important. We take individual lives as very important, and infanticide of a born child is a very important issue. We are very retributive when it comes to that. Murders, sometimes it's a matter of who does the murdering. Wars, and now this staggering question of what will be the result of the global warming, to me, is something on which church groups, Catholic or whatever, are very remiss if they don't give that tremendous priority over the kinds of things, these family value things, some family value things, not other family value things, they get very excited about.
When we look at global warming, as we take Ermal's question here, we can say that a devout Muslim may well say that we, all of us, submit within the shadow of Allah. A Jew reading the first book of Genesis will say we are all of us made B'Tselem Elohim. Catholic will say we are all made from the very same book, Imago Dei. We are all made in the image of God. Whether we are in the shadow of God or in the image of God, the point is the same. When we see global warming, we know that life at every single stage is endangered. There can be no greater family value or life-centered value than saving life on this planet after what we have done to it. Ermal.
So, Ermal Hitay, economics grad student and also working for the IMF. My question is, so it's pretty clear that the financing of religious community activities could be an extremely beneficial thing. However, then the pressing issue is who's the judge of what amount of money goes to whom. And I was just thinking, and that's a serious issue, because that could induce religious communities to compete not in doing good, but in getting government funding. And it would also strengthen the government and weaken the society and the religious groups. So I was thinking about a very simple rule of thumb. What about distributing that amount of money in proportion to the numbers of religious communities in the United States? That would be one question. And it would shortchange a number of communities. As you said, the Muslims might be a small percentage, say 8, 9, 10, I don't know. But they have done a disproportionately good amount of work in the prisons. Now, it would shortchange some communities, but it would close that hornet's nest that Jerome was talking about. That's the first question. The second question is, as I was thinking of that, as a good economist to be, I thought, well, that's actually the mathematical equivalent of a church tax. So if you distribute tax money to people according to their ratios in the society, that's basically what you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. So then the question would be, what about the church tax? If we are to fund religious community charities because they're a good thing, then we might do that just through there. Or what about a more flexible version of the church tax, when one could either pay it to the state or pay it to the religious charity organization that she or he chooses to?
Yeah.
Thank you. Just thinking aloud, by the way.
Yes, thinking aloud very, very clearly.
Yes, amen.
The church tax, it's really very foreign concept to the United States. It exists in Germany for a very peculiar reason. The church in Germany, as anywhere else in Europe, had accumulated a lot of property. Voluntary contributions, big contributions. It was one of the big landholders anywhere. And in 1803, Napoleon, marching through Germany, confiscated it all. There was a question of compensation then. What is going to be done about that? And ever since then, it's more than 2 centuries now, the compensation has been that the government pays all the expenses. And that, by now, you have to go back and try to figure, how did that ever happen? And it's an odd thing to happen. I wanted to make a distinction. I was asked here, and I didn't quite have an answer. What should we really be advising the faith-based office or public policy or the American public to be doing? seems to me that the distinction should be made. You can't really stop that smile or the Francis walking around and looking good. What you can stop, you're going to give money to an organization that is going to use that money then to elect its guy. There you have this turn from the interests of people to the interest of the institutional power, looking for its guy who will support it. There, I think this is something, it can't be done only by government. I think this is a matter of building a public awareness so that people are really instinctively aware when that happens and stop it. Government and law have got to participate in that. But it is a matter of public consciousness and public insistence that this is not the function of faith. You know, you get any kind of institution, faith institution, whatever. Anytime you get people organized for a stamp club, you have to have a leadership. You aren't organized unless you've got a leadership. And you kind of hope that the interests of the organization and the interests of the leadership are going to be identical. They never quite are, because the leadership of any organization has an interest in continuing to be the leadership. And the further apart they get, the more trouble you're in. And you get to the point where you really got to get rid of that leadership, and it could be tough, because they'll be very entrenched. If the organization has turned from the interest of humanity, good offices, to the human, to maintaining its power, then you're in big trouble. That's the kind of thing that I think we really need to be monitoring and preventing.
Now, very appropriately, we have one of the foremost sociologists of religion in America to put, sadly, the last question. Dr. D'Antonio.
Antonio.
Bill D'Antonio, Life Cycle. For the last 10 years, I've been studying all roll call votes in the U.S. Congress. Is this on? Oh. Am I on now?
You're on.
I've been studying
Live.
roll call votes in the U.S. Congress. Going back to the 1960s, party line loyalty would account for about 1/3 of all votes. Religion, region of the country, favors back and forth account for the rest of the votes. By 1995, party loyalty counts for 90% of all votes. By 2005, in the Republican Party, it's up to 95%, and among the Democrats, it's anywhere between 88 and 92%. Democrats are still not as disciplined as Republicans. We're in that kind of a society now, where we are so polarized that and you see it now in the health care bill. So I want to go back to an incident in the 1960s when it began under Eisenhower, and that was the idea of supporting family planning clinics with public funding. It drifted for several years until the 1965, when a George Washington Jesuit law professor, Dexter Hanley, appeared before the American Bar Association and wrote a proposal explaining how all religious groups in the U.S., whatever their stand on family planning, it could support financing of family planning clinics, as long as all methods of family planning were offered to anyone who visited the clinic, and there were all kinds of guarantees against coercion. I picked that idea up. I read Hanley's statement. I received some money from an unnamed priest. I was at Notre Dame at the time. It wasn't Father Hesburgh, but he supported my work. I put ads in the National Catholic Reporter and Commonweal and received support for Father Hanley's statement from 517 Catholics, mostly in academia, but also in hospitals and medical schools. So Father Hanley and I went to the Clark Tidings Committee in May of 1966, and both appeared in support of the Clark Tidings bill to provide family planning funding from the U.S. Congress under the conditions explained by Father Hanley. Congress passed the bill in November of 1966, and while I don't want to take too much credit, the New York Times and the Washington Post said our two witness statements were the most important statements made. Now, that simply means that the Congress was open to discussion. You can't imagine Congress being able to carry on any discussion on abortion if it can't even do it on health care. So as we think about the situation that we're in now, we are so polarized that it's that the situation that I've been studying for the last 10 years has simply gotten worse, so that what we see in Congress today on the health care bill is simply maybe we could dream of the last expression of this polarization, except that perhaps Father Ray can tell us how to get out of it.
There you go.
Oh, boy.
The man with the answers.
Good grief, I wonder, have you any thoughts on this?
Well, I do want to note that Bill D'Antonio just compounded the mess.
Well, yes.
Because of looking at Congress, we see what a problem it is. If you can't discuss health care, how are you going to discuss this? And we do know
Can
that
you
Congress has
discuss on its
consistently
merits?
passed laws that conflict with its own laws. Because each
Yes.
congressional appropriation that looks to groups other than the feds either does or does not stipulate, even in the same Congress, that you may or you may not discriminate in religious hiring. The same Congress passing two bills will make it the law and make it against the law.
Yeah. I think if you can find a way to see that these questions are dealt with on their merits, institutions that are really concerned with their own power position are really the noxious element in this. And if you can really define the question in such ways that it can be seen apart from the power questions, that's supposedly the way we designed our Congress. People have found their way around it. And now Congress seems to be very much controlled by a very narrow group of special interests. And when we look for any kind of constitutional reform in the country, that's where we really need to be aiming.
To give you just one idea as we close, since healthcare became the issue of the year, this year, the special interests lobbying on Capitol Hill spend more money in one day than most states on healthcare in a year.
Yeah.
What's wrong with that picture? And I wonder, on that depressing, deeply depressing note, if we could have Jenna elevate the tone and restore us to some hope.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.